make some plans.
Mm.
What about you?
Oh, well, I got some health stuff going on, man. So I'm not doing too much these days. Kind of living on savings, to be honest. I I got. Hey, you aren't recording. You're recording now.
I just said we're going live. So we're
Yeah,
live now.
no problem.
All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Cool.
Well, I got some health stuff going on. That's all I'll say.
All right. Savad is on an airplane and he's going to be landing right about now. So he'll join us later when his taxi gets him to his destination. We'll pay attention to any messages he sends us from the reading, which he's done. All right. We've got lots of awesome stuff to talk about. Oh, he just sent a message, a whole bunch of them. Okay. So we'll talk about that in a minute. We got lots of awesome things to talk about. But in the after show of last class, Path brought up, I asked him the question I meant to ask him before we stopped recording, and his answer, I think, is extremely interesting and worth talking about. So before we even get into Campbell, who's going to make the same point that Path made, you anticipated one of the criticisms that you can make to Schlick and some of these perspectives. I'll ask the question again. If you give us your answer again, we'll start the discussion. So last class, you had mentioned sort of off the cuff while making another point that there's other explanations for punitive systems, right? Schlick is saying we punish people so that we find the right person who has the motive for the action we want less of, and then we punish them, and that's the whole point of morality. And Campbell is going to argue pretty powerfully that he's wrong about all of that. But you mentioned almost in passing, well, that's not really what punitive systems are about. So I asked you, and I meant to ask you, oh, that's so curious, because everybody we've read so far has basically agreed that a deterrence system of punishment is the only one philosophically defensible. And from every camp, they've been sort of saying that. And you said the opposite. And I thought, well, here, I'll just ask, what other sort of punitive system do you think makes sense?
Well, yeah, they were arguing. All their points were made along the lines of whether punishing a criminal was deterrence, for the criminal, or maybe it's deterrent for um, society. But really, the value in putting violent criminals or repeat offenders away, or even criminals, is to protect the society itself. And no, a man himself can't make a law, I believe is what I said.
Okay.
A man can only hold a club, or have a unilateral morality or way of implementing a system. Anyways, listen. Uh,
So let's talk about that.
there is no way that you need a society to create the laws, and the laws protect the society. And all these arguments are based on the individual as opposed to society, and I think that's a flaw.
All right, I think you've got a bit of a point there. That's actually pretty earth-shattering to the tendencies of all the philosophers we've been reading and the fads of today. So let's talk about it. So this deterrence. So it's been brought up that there's three philosophical defenses for punishment: retributive, like we want to get back at the evildoer; deterrence, make him know he shouldn't do it again, and like you say, tell others, hey, this warning, this might happen to you if you do something like that, to deter it from happening. And then the third one would be rehabilitative, like we're going to fix the criminal. So the first thing to notice is that Schlick is saying, I'm in the deterrence camp. And pretty much any philosopher we've read, I think, so far, maybe I'm wrong and misremembering, but basically if they bring up punishment at all, they say, well, everybody knows essentially that deterrence is the only one philosophically justifiable, is that you're trying to stop the bad actions, and that's all there is to it. The first thing to notice is that Schlick's argument isn't really about deterrence. He says it is, but it's deterrence overlapping with rehabilitation in a sense, right? Because you could deter other people from doing it, but he's also saying we're turning the person who does this sort of thing into the person less likely to do this sort of thing. And so it's kind of a little bit mixed, the two. But what you're saying is, sounds like you're putting forward a fourth type of punitive theory about protective. Like the whole point of it is just to keep the law-abiding citizens from having to run into vicious criminals in the street.
Yeah, you can have a high trust society if you are going to release criminals again and again, because, hey, man, everything's determinist or whatever. He's a poor Aladdin. He's socially and economically disadvantaged. Well, okay. I'm not saying these things aren't true. What I'm saying is, if you keep releasing uh, that person because you've abdicated him of his responsibility, then you're not protecting society. And yeah, part of release, removing people from society because they're acting poorly is in the benefit of society, and it's not so much about the individual.
Now, I think that's really interesting. So, first of all, you just brought up another idea that Campbell's going to bring up. So, you seem to instinctively be a Campbellian before we even read him. But this idea that, what did you say there? You said, oh, well, we give allotment. Like we say, okay, there's degrees of guilt. We could look at someone and say, we need to lock him up. But we really pity him. We're not angry at him. We say, oh, isn't it a shame that he had such a horrible upbringing and he was tortured from a young age? And, we don't hate the guy. We feel bad that he's been so horribly abused, and yet we still lock him up. And so Campbell's argument that we'll look at in a minute, one of his arguments is, look, we're not even saying he's morally wrong. We're still punishing him, though. We're still locking him up. And that shows that we have ideas of morality that are different from sometimes the morality's there and the punishment's not. Sometimes the punishment's there, but the moral blame finger wagging is not. Where we say, look, how could a poor wretch like this even help himself? I mean, it's so sad that he had this horrible things happen to him. And, how can you expect him to act any better than that? So we're not even giving him moral blame, but we're still saying he has to get locked up. So putting that aside, let's get back to your protectivism theory. I think it's really interesting. One of the things that I think it makes it ridiculously powerful, and it's so interesting how powerful it is, because like I said, pretty much even Socrates, in philosophy, philosophers tend to have this idea that people are more rational and they're more thinking than they really are. And so sometimes they're blind to things just because they're philosophers. And I think I've never heard this idea before, but I'm stealing it from you because I think you're really onto something here. I want to see how strong it is and play with it a bit. But one of the things that philosophers might tend to be blind to is the idea that they think other people think too. Right. And so, the only justification is they're weighing their pros and cons. And so we'll give them an extra con with the punishment and maybe they'll make a different decision. And there's an awful lot of psychology and real understanding of how people work that they might be missing potentially, not always. But then the other thing is to simply notice that that's what we're actually doing. All right. I think the real power of your argument. Oh, Savad has made it. I'm sorry. I'll add you in here. My bad. I think the real power of what you say is that we can theorize all day long and we can tell ourselves we're putting you in jail because we're trying to add a deterrence. And maybe there's an element of that going on. But the real truth is what we don't want to admit to ourselves, maybe for whatever reason, maybe we should be thrilled to embrace it. But for whatever reason, we feel ashamed to say, no, we have a right to say certain people can't choose where they sleep at night, and society's individuals have a right to walk down the street without bumping into a person like this. And that might be the actual justification of locking people up. That I'm not even saying that that's correct or that we even should have prisons. I'm saying what we're doing seems to be more like what your insight is than what all of the philosophers have argued so far that we've looked at and say, well, we're doing it for deterrence. It's all very rational and it makes sense. I think it just might be the naked fact that that's not what we're doing, and that the philosophers are in a position to be uniquely blind to the forest for the trees on this one. And so I just thought that was a hell of an insight, and I wanted to have that discussion before we got started with Campbell today because it was in the after show.
Yeah, I think it was a valid point, and I appreciate you wanting to talk about it.
Quite interesting.
I think it's a really valid point. And that's one of the flaws in all their argument. If you're using something like that, in my opinion, okay, if you're using something like that as a justification for these arguments, the foundation isn't solid, in my opinion.
You might have found a hole. You might have found a hole, and we'd have to explore it more. We're going to have to see how strong this idea is by testing it out more. But I also think that, we should have to look at, well, how much is Schlick relying on that in order to make his point? And if he really is relying on it, that might be another way that you could attack his position. In fact, I think Campbell is going to sort of attack it from that direction. So, hey, it's good to see you, Savad. I'm glad you had a nice plane trip and that you arrived safely. And it's good to have you here. We've got your notes here that we'll look at. But why don't we get into today's lecture, and we'll just talk about the reading. There was quite a lot in it. You'll notice that Schlick has long sentences, and that he's sort of, I'm not Schlick, I'm sorry. Campbell has long sentences. They're not bad sentences. They're long, and he tends to want to say 3 things at a time in each one of them. So it makes the reading uniquely interesting and potentially challenging. All right, let's see how much he can say. So Schlick denies the basic framework of the question, and he is wrong to do so. That's the first claim of Campbell. Hey, Norm, get out of here. You can't make noises like that. Go lay down. Go lay down. Go. All right, so Campbell is going to come into this, and it's really funny how he does it, because we've got all these compatibilists saying from the left flank of the field of battle between the determinists and the libertarians, they're saying, stop. You can have your cake and eat it too. Determinism doesn't really mean this compulsion. It's just a descriptor thing, and freedom, you must want that in order for your freedom to make sense. So don't go looking for metaphysical agency and things like that. It's just they go together very well. And all these, there was a time in the story here where there were a lot of people who were basically congratulating themselves that they had solved the problem of free will and determinism. And what's really funny about Campbell is he comes out of the woods on the other side of the battlefield just while people are being convinced, oh, maybe we shouldn't attack free will just because we're determinists. Oh, maybe I can embrace determinism, even though I really care about free will. Let's put our guns down. Let's stop fighting. And Campbell comes in out of the woods from the other side of the battlefield, and he says, stop with the truce. This really is a problem. Let's get the fighting going back again, because we need to sort this out and we're nowhere close to a solution. And so the purpose of his essay is to say determinism precludes the kind of freedom that you should want to have, no matter what Schlick says. So he comes into the argument and he says, Schlick denies the basic framework. He thinks he's solved the problem. He thinks we don't need a war over this. And further, he points out that Schlick is linking moral responsibility with punishment as an educative measure to affect future behavior, which requires a kind of predictability of a person's actions and motives. So morality requires predictability. And of course, we know Schlick's whole argument is, if you want freedom and moral responsibility, you better hope that determinism is true, because things have to be predictable to make sense of punishment. And morality is really just about nothing but punishment. And now Campbell's going to come in and he's going to give a number of arguments to say, is that really what morality is about? I think morality is about a great deal more than that. I think it overlaps with punishment, but sometimes the punishment isn't even a factor. So he's going to attack Schlick's whole idea. And so first he points it out. His first problem is this. His first argument. We don't hold animals morally responsible. We don't think, oh, you chose wickedly, you evil creature. But we still punish them to affect their behavior. So there's an instance where the punishment as an educative measure is completely there, but that has nothing to do with our normal sense of morality and praiseworthiness and aspiration to be like, or finger wagging to say shame on you. We're not really doing that, he says, when we punish a dog by slapping it on the nose and saying, no, don't eat my pork chops, I think is his example. So that's his first argument, to say maybe these things aren't really the same thing. And then his second argument is, we do say that dead men are responsible for the current state of affairs. If we adopt Schlick's argument, we'd have to say that Hitler is not morally responsible for anything, because we couldn't punish him right now for what he did. So there's no morality issue about Hitler, right? How can we say Hitler is a moral demon if we couldn't punish him right now? And Schlick says the whole point of morality talk is to figure out who to punish to affect future behavior. So, but he says, so it's important to look at the way that Campbell is thinking. What he's saying is, let me examine the way we talk about morality so that I can see, do we talk about it in ways that Schlick doesn't account for? In which case, I'm not saying we definitely are free. I'm just saying you haven't solved the problem. There are people who want to have moral responsibility and freedom in a way that you haven't rescued in your deterministic framework by saying, oh, all that morality is about punishment. So it's important to see what he's doing and how he's doing it. What he's doing is saying Schlick didn't solve the problem. It's not a pseudo problem. It's a real problem. And the way he's doing it is he's saying, well, how do we talk about morality? Just generally, what do we mean? And what in this idea seems to matter to us? And is that idea rescued by Schlick? And he says, no, it's not. Okay. So one of the ways we talk about morality is that we blame dead people for morally reprehensible behavior, even though we can't punish them. We say, look, they did all these horrible things, and look at the horrible world we're living in now because of them. Shame on people like that. He says all of history, with all of the condemnations of bad things in the past, would make no sense if we adopted Schlick's perspective that the only reason we talk about morality at all is to identify who really should be punished to make their future actions less likely to be the same. Okay. So let's see. We say a dead man is responsible for current state of affairs, but it makes no sense to talk of punishing him for educational reasons to affect his future behavior. And then his third argument is, if many bad things happen to a young man during his developing years, this is the thing that Path just brought up. If a person has a really unfortunate upbringing, we conceptualize under Schlick's theories that bad education, we say, oh, he had a bad education and it made him do bad things. So if Schlick is correct, we should say all of our sense of moral condemnation is attached to how likely you are to do bad things based on your bad education. So we want to punish you to give you a better education. But then Campbell says that's not what we do. What we do is say, okay, maybe we have to lock you up, but we really pity you. We don't think you're morally responsible. Our idea of morality is not more involved here. It's less involved. We say, oh, you poor creature. It's so terrible. We locked up your parents for torturing you. And we wish we had gotten to it sooner because look at what they did to you to turn you into somebody who, look, if that happened to me, I would probably be like that too. And, you know, we take away a lot of their moral responsibility at the exact moment that we're confirming Schlick's theory in the sense of, you've got lots of evidence that the bad education made bad things likely to happen, and that maybe you need to punish in order to deter the person from doing it again or something like that. So how can it possibly be that our idea of morality has been rescued by Schlick if the very instance where it's clear that this is all about education, we think, well, it's all about education and has nothing to do with morality. We make allotment and allowances and we say, oh yeah, I don't really blame the guy, but it's his parents' fault, or it's his upbringing, or the horrible things that happen to him. It's not really his fault. Well, in that situation, you're saying there's even more educative effect that's causing the action. So shouldn't you, in Schlick's theory, say, oh, let's really punish this guy. Let's make it hurt so we can counterbalance all this horrible bad education that made him do bad things. He goes, that's not the way we talk. And that's not what we mean by morality. So Schlick must be wrong. So those are his first three arguments that he does. Why don't we pause there? We're going to have a lot to talk. Oh, I'm sorry, Path. I'll add you back in here again. We're going to have a lot to talk about because Campbell does an awful lot in this essay. So let's pause there. What do you guys think about, first, Campbell's desire or his aim at saying Schlick didn't really solve the problem? Secondly, about his method of saying, well, let's look at how we talk about it and say, did you rescue that? And if not, I say there's still a problem. And then third, we'll look at each of the arguments and see what you think about those. So first of all, when you did the reading, what did you think about Campbell's argument that Schlick did not save the day and rescue determinism and free will at the same time, or moral responsibility at the same time? Any thoughts? You don't have
Okay, I'll go first. I think that's an easy argument to make because so far, and I'm new to this, but in this book, all the philosophers we've read so far, no one's had a overpowering, convincing argument. And then, but it's kind of like with the first philosopher, and we came across that pointed this out was William James, I believe. Uh, and this argument's really nuanced. It's kind of metaphysical, and it's there's no amount of words you can apply to this argument to prove anything. It seems, but
Yeah.
there's a lot of word. There's a lot. I think the kids call them word cells now. There's a lot of word cells that are trying to, and I've read a few of them. I don't know if anybody else knows what I mean, but yeah, that'd be what I said.
No, I don't know what you mean, but you're right. William James has said this isn't a solvable problem, so we need to do philosophy to decide which world we want to say we live in, but we can't really resolve it. And you're also, I think it's interesting to point out what you said there, which is if you're congratulating yourself that you've solved the problem, how come none of you have said something that would make me think it's not a problem anymore? Okay, I see. Thank you. I see your note. Okay, so yeah, I mean, how can you say I solved the problem if there's still people arguing? I mean, by definition, you haven't really solved the problem in a very convincing way. And I think Campbell, on top of that, we could add, he makes a lot of arguments that at least Schlick has not solved it. Maybe some other compatibilist has, and there were lots of them doing it in different ways. But I think his arguments are pretty powerful that what we mean by morality has not really been rescued by Schlick when he reduces it to just educative measurements of identifying who to punish. So yeah, two very good points. Thank you for that. If there's anything else you want to say, please speak up. Otherwise, I know some of you have noise in the background. Oh, all right. We've got a comment from someone who has noise in the background. Is free will a pseudo problem? The less free a man is, we have allowances. True. Argument for nurture or lack thereof. One's resources or lack thereof have an impact on morality. We judge, regardless of one's options or lack of resources, that the moral decision should have been made. There's an intuitive nature to do the moral thing. Yeah, this is, okay, good. Good character is built by moral decisions, despite the necessary resources. Making moral decisions with less resources builds more. Yeah, okay. That's exact. That instinct right there is what Campbell is going to say. Look, stop pretending you don't know what we're talking about. I'm going to push right there and say this morality thing is about something way different than something that fits in with your descriptive version of determinism. What we mean is warring against your instincts and warring against your nature and warring against your inclinations and doing the whole point of moral heroism is that you're not doing the thing that we would predict a person would do based on all the factors, that there's some ghostly area where you can say 1,000 times I've done the wrong thing, but today I'm sick of it. And I'm going to say enough with the darkness, I'm turning in another direction, something like that. And if that's possible for us, then there's a kind of freedom that isn't within that causal determinism. Again, we're not saying that's right or wrong, but what Campbell's pointing out is the way we talk about morality is like that. And you didn't rescue that, Schlick. You didn't rescue that at all. You rescued something that doesn't even overlap with morality sometimes, even though often it does. So yeah, I think that's the point of what he's getting at. All right, so I have a general question now. Instead of what do we think about his argument so much as what do you think about the method of saying, to solve this problem, I'm not going to logically prove what morality is. I'm going to start with how do we talk about morality, and then I'll decide whether or not, I'll see if the ideas make sense, and maybe I'll say we're talking about it inaccurately. But let's start with how we talk about it as our first point and say, did you rescue that? Do you think that's a legitimate way of approaching a philosophical question?
In my opinion, I think it was, and that's based on what I think I recall Schlick doing. I think Schlick was using the same method of sort of appealing to what the most people do or whatever, or like sort of the norms or how we think about morality. I think Campbell was just kind of like carrying the torch in that way, sort of like he's like, okay, we're going to do it this way. Then he sort of makes good points in that same method. I will say on a more general note, this guy's like I'm very love-hate with him. I basically I feel like he expressed, at least I think he expressed, what I was like roundabout kind of thinking, but didn't really clarify when I read Schlick. And I think that Campbell was mentioning a lot of the same ones, but that's just a general. So I like him in the sense that it seems like we're thinking on the exact same lines. I sort of have, the hate side of it is, as Path said, yeah, I think he's a word cell here, and I guess that would mean he's sort of overly a wordsmith. And yeah, that getting at three things at once in one sentence is really annoying. But I do see value in that. There's,
Yeah.
I think it's a two-part. It's a double-edged sword to me. So I do think that you can really build like attention and all this. Like you can really build yourself by reading somebody highly annoying and frustrating like this. On the other hand, I really wish that um, he could like do a side. I wish people who write like this could do a side by side. And it's like on the other side, it's like, okay, here's what I actually mean. I'm gonna cut the shit and just say what I actually mean, because there's points there where I'm like, okay, I think I'm getting what you're saying. I could have said that about 100 times better, and I'm like a retard. So I maybe it's not better, just it's
Sure.
more clear to me and people like me.
It's
Sorry.
possible. Yeah, I don't think he's too obscure, but yeah, it's possible. And he's certainly adding a lot of complicated ideas into each sentence often. And I think you said both of the things I was hoping to say about that, which is one, that should be looked at by us as an opportunity. Let me read more people like this until I also think in three thoughts at a time, and that would be great. But also, I agree with you that, like, okay, there's a lot of people, and I don't think Campbell is doing this at all, but there's a lot of people who just try to use obscurity to hide the fact that they're not really saying anything. And then if you can't say it in a straightforward manner, maybe you don't really have something to say. I don't think that fits with Campbell. I think he's in the first category of, all right, I have to read each sentence very slowly to really get what he's saying. But once I do, I'm learning how to run with weights on. And then when I take them off, I'll be able to run a lot faster. And it's good training for us. So I think I agree with all of that.
A little tidbit, I think to counter that, as far as reading slow, I instead started to read fast, and I found that was because of because he goes in these different directions. It's like, okay, if I just read it fast, then I can overlook some of these points that shouldn't be emphasized so much.
It's the parentheticals, right? So you have to read the first part, and then you have to really quickly read the next part so that you can remember what the first part is. I mean, this is just mental training, and it's awesome. And so, yeah, it's painful, but you can get really good at it really quickly. If you read like 3 books by people who write like that, you'll start having no trouble at all. And it's really, really great training. So I think I like Campbell for that reason. But yeah, it's he's definitely doing that, and it can be frustrating. There's another insight that you had, which I wasn't sure I was going to highlight, but since you picked up on it, let's talk about it. I think what Campbell is doing is on purpose. I think he's purposefully taking the methods of the Schlick-like camp of people, and he's doing it better than they do it. He's holding their feet to the fire and adopting their methods on purpose to say, look, you don't need a whole new method system or a whole new approach like William James. I'm going to do what you did, but I'm going to do it way more and show that everything you're saying is bullshit. And you can tell he's quite snarky in a lot of his tonality. And that's fitting because that's what he's doing. He's entering the conversation. And so the snarkiness fits because he's saying, you're congratulating yourselves that you solved the problem. I'm going to approach the problem the same way you did. I'm going to do it way more seriously. And I'm going to show that you should stop patting yourself on the back. You've done nothing. And you sort of can't get away with doing that unless you just embrace the fact that you're being an asshole. And he kind of, I don't think he's being a jerk, but he definitely plays into the whole snarkiness a little bit. And it's fitting tonally because that's intellectually what he's accomplishing there or trying to accomplish. All right. So that's interesting to note. Those are really great comments. All right. How about this? He gives three quick arguments to say, look, I don't know what the truth is. And even at the end of the essay, he's not going to say, I've given you an argument for libertarianism. He's not going to even give an argument to try to defend libertarianism. His whole purpose of this article is to say, the battle is on. Stop with your truce. Stop with your ceasefire. You did not rescue morality underneath determinism by understanding determinism correctly and understanding morality correctly and showing that they fit together. There's a morality we care about that you would be lost even with your correctly understood idea of determinism, and that's all he's trying to prove. So to do that, he starts off by saying, let me demonstrate that Schlick has not solved the problem. And he does that with three arguments. And I'm wondering, does anybody have any comments about his argument that we don't hold dogs morally responsible and yet we still punish them? Isn't that a good way of showing that sometimes the Venn diagram is two independent circles and they don't overlap at all? What do you think of that argument?
I was kind of wondering how Schlick would respond, and I'm just imagining that he would, I don't know, just sort of make these arbitrary boundaries between animals and humans and say, like, well, that doesn't apply because they're animals. I don't know how effective that would be, though.
I hadn't thought about that. To me, it seems like the obvious answer from Schlick would be, of course, we're holding animals morally responsible. To hold them morally responsible is just to say, what's the rightly identified source of the bad behavior I want to discourage, and then giving educative punishment to make that action less likely to happen. But when he makes that argument, which is what he'd be inclined to think, he'd be sort of highlighting the fact that we don't really have a kind of freedom more than what we think of a dog, which wants a treat and doesn't want to get smacked on the snout, right? So Campbell's argument in that sense is pretty powerful because Schlick can't really respond to it the way that his system, at least, would suggest he'd be inclined to respond. He would say, well, no, we are holding them morally responsible. I already said to hold something morally responsible is to say you are rightly identified as the source of the action I want to discourage, and so it is right for me to punish you. That's all we mean by morality. And then if he responds that way, I think Campbell would look at him and go, oh, you thought that's what we wanted to rescue? That's how morally significant you think we humans think we are? Yeah, my point is made. My point is made. That's all you've rescued. But I think Schlick would have to, I think he'd be very, I mean, we don't know what he would say, but I think he'd be very likely to respond that way. But there's another response that we might give, which is Campbell, I think we are holding dogs morally responsible to some degree, not in the vague way that you want to criticize Schlick for doing, but in the series, I think dogs have motives. And I think dogs feel shame. I mean, sometimes we punish the dog by saying, ooh, bad boy. And the dog goes, oh, I've been bad. It's like, yeah, he's feeling shame. He knows he shouldn't run down the street. And yet he looks back at you when you're saying, come. And he says, no, I'm going. Like he knows, this isn't the only argument someone could make. And people could say, well, that's ridiculous. Dogs are just being motivated by their triggers or whatever. But it's possible for someone to say, I think the internal life of a dog is more sophisticated than we think it is, or than we're pretending it is in this conversation. And so we are doing the same thing with a dog, not because we're as low as dogs are, but because dogs are more sophisticated than we've pretended they are. They're not the same as humans. They can't deliberate and reflect upon the ideas and all of that sort of thing, but they are dealing in shame and praise. And so they're not just robots. I think Campbell's response to that would be like, well, maybe you're right about dogs, but there's something between a clam and a person is an animal that's just basically being motivated by triggers. And that's what Schlick is talking about. So it's really a non sequitur to argue that dogs have a more sophisticated internal life than that. But I've been in classrooms where, especially the female population of the student body, really revolts against this idea that dogs and cats don't have personalities and morally significant attitudes and things like that. So it often comes up, but it doesn't have to. We could think that the dogs are Cartesian robots or something. And
Hey,
anyway,
time out a second. Are you saying that the females in the classrooms uh, were reacting against the premise that dogs and cats have personalities and uh, emotional reactions to things? Or maybe I misheard
no,
you.
they were doing the opposite. They were reacting against the philosopher idea that dogs and cats are just like robots. They're not like us in any way.
Oh, I see.
They were doing the opposite. They said, no, my dog has I know he cares about me and all that. And I think they could be right. I mean, that's a totally different day for another discussion, and it's a real hard thing to work out how we would even, work out what a dog thinks because they can't talk. So we won't do any of that right now. And we'll just simply say that often comes up, but I think it's a non sequitur. I don't think it matters to Campbell's point. All he's saying is, okay, how about a fish? All right, how about a clam? It's got one neuron and it just closes when you trigger it. I mean, the clam's not feeling shame or praise or any of that stuff. He doesn't have pride. He's a robot. So something between a clam and a person. There's animals that we might punish in the sense of try to get them to behave differently through pain or reward, but they're not feeling shame or pride or anything like that. And so I don't think it would hurt Campbell's argument, even if somebody were to win the day with some sort of an argument that proves that dogs are more sophisticated than that. It's just worth bringing up. All right. The second argument is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hey, I got a question.
Yeah.
So he's arguing against Schlick here in that way. But what if Schlick's point via, regarding the dogs and the animals is the carrot and stick behavior as opposed to the personality thing? What if that's part of the argument or it wasn't, clear? Because I think there's a point to be made
That is
that,
Schlick.
even with humans, a carrot and stick is very, it's very effective,
Campbell
depending
agrees.
on, depending on degrees and extremes. Yeah. Okay. And sometimes, you don't, a small carrot and a small stick, but sometimes a big carrot and a big stick or whatever, these
Yeah.
are your options. And so humans, although obviously we have more, we have the option to verbalize and have discussions, and dogs don't do that. And there's all kinds of differences, but that's a similarity. And it felt like, in a way that you were explaining it, he's arguing against a part that maybe Schlick meant, or was implying something different. I'm not sure.
Well,
But,
no,
that's what I
that's
was thinking.
question. That's a good question. So I think that the way we'll clarify that is not that they're talking about something different. It's to say this. Schlick is definitely making that argument. He's saying people are like dogs. It's a carrot and a stick, and that's all what we mean by morality. Campbell agrees with what you just said. He agrees that there's a great deal of that. There's a large portion of what we talk about when we're talking about morality, a large portion of what we're talking about is stuff like that. But Campbell says that's not all we're talking about. And sometimes we're talking about things that have nothing to do with that. So Campbell's argument isn't that never applies. Of course it applies. It applies a great deal. What Campbell's saying is here's a couple of instances to highlight the fact that that's not really the core of what we care about when we talk about morality. It matters and they overlap a great degree, but that's not what we mean by morality. Morality means something more or different than that because, look, here's a few examples where they don't overlap at all or where they're in opposite directions. Okay, so yeah, he would agree. Campbell agrees that, of course, carrots and sticks work on people. He doesn't think everything a person does is some sort of God acting independent from all causes and just doing things. He doesn't think that at all. He believes that sometimes a person can do something morally significant. And when he is, it has nothing to do with this carrot stick thing. That applies to almost everything, but that's not what we want to rescue when we want to rescue morality. So that's a really good question. And I think that's the correct way of clarifying that, is that Campbell's not saying that doesn't apply at all. He's saying that's not what we really want to save when we're saving the idea of morality. So you didn't save what we really care about. Does that make sense? Does that flow? Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank
That's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up to highlight it. That'll get us some clarity there. All right. So his second argument to prove that what we mean by morality and what we want to mean by it and what we don't want to lose is not just this carrot stick thing, although that applies, is to say, well, don't we think of people who are already dead as moral monsters? And we go on and on about shame, shame. We need to make sure that people like that don't get any power again. What a horrible monster Hitler was. I mean, he's dead now. I can't punish him. But I still think that when I talk about him being morally reprehensible, I think I'm meaning something, right? There seems to be some meaning to my idea of morality that isn't encapsulated in that carrot stick talk, because I can't have a carrot or a stick big enough to punish Hitler's future behaviors. He's already dead. So that's not what we're talking about. If you want to rescue morality, you didn't rescue any of that. Does that sound like a good argument?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be his strongest argument. I mean, what he's saying is all of the history books should be reduced to chronology, because any moral lesson you could get out of it would be meaningless if Schlick is correct. I mean, by the time he makes that second argument, I wonder why he even needed the first or the third. I mean, that second argument seems to be so devastating to Schlick's position.
I'd even piggyback that and say that morality uh, gets redefined almost every decade, according to my life, and
That's
it's probably happening at a quicker pace now than in their era. But that's something that wasn't mentioned that I think is something to bring up, though.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. All right. It's true. It's true. Okay, so let's look quickly at his third argument. If many bad things happen to a young, okay, so we know this third argument, and actually Path anticipated this, or Twilight did. I think Path, this is one of the things that you anticipated about Campbell by thinking along the same lines, which is, look, if it's all about the carrots and the sticks, how come we feel less moral outrage at a person who does horrible things if they've had a lot of sticks that made them do it? If you're saying that's where morality is to be found, shouldn't we have more moral outrage? Shouldn't there be more moral talk rather than us saying, oh, he could hardly help it. It's so sad the way the world is. We should make a world that's better so we don't have poor people, poor, unfortunate, people tortured as young children into the point where they can't even get along with society, and where it only makes sense for them to be violent and horrible. It's like, yeah, maybe we have to lock them up for the other reason Path pointed out, that you still can't let a person like that run freely, but all you feel is pity for him. You don't feel moral outrage against him. You think, what a sad world. I hate his parents, or I hate the person who abused him, or whatever, much more than I'm angry at this person for what they did. And Campbell's point is, look, if Schlick is correct, that's all of morality is in the carrots and the sticks. So if you can really understand a person's behavior by carrots and sticks, shouldn't you say, we should be more upset, punish him more, we must counterbalance those other sticks that pushed him in the wrong direction? But that's not what we do. We say, it hurts me to even say we have to lock him up because this poor wretched person never stood a chance. So our morality talk gets toned down at the very moment that the sticks and the carrots are most saliently a part of the story. And what do you think about that argument against Schlick and his idea that he rescued morality talk that we care about through carrot and stick talk?
I think it's good, provided that that's surely what Schlick is doing. I have to go back and read Schlick, because I guess I wasn't aware that that was exactly what he was doing. And
Okay.
so I guess it's a matter of making sure that's what he's doing, which I'm sure Campbell did the homework on that, and he is indeed doing that.
Let's look into it. So Schlick definitely didn't say something like, we should want to be more outraged at the person who couldn't help it because his upbringing was so bad. But what Schlick did do, I think, if I remember correctly, is say, morality talk is not threatened by determinism. Determinism is just descriptive. It doesn't make you do anything. And besides, morality talk is only about identifying the right person to punish. That's all morality talk is really about. And that kind of talk requires that that descriptive level of determinism be true, or else you could never predict how a person would act. Punish him all you want. You might make him do it more. I mean, you have to believe in that kind of determinism to say that the punishment makes sense to deter the action. And so he thinks he's taken all of the valuable ideas of morality that we wouldn't want to see destroyed, and he's shown that they're not just compatible, they rely upon a kind of determinism. But the way he does it is he says morality is only about sticks and carrots. He doesn't use that phrase, but it's only about understanding how to encourage or discourage desirable or undesirable behavior by identifying the right motive owner, the source of why that action happened, and then hitting him with a stick so he doesn't do it as much, or praising him so he's encouraged to do it more. And so if that's correct, Campbell is saying, well, why don't we apply that in an area you didn't apply it? Why don't we apply it to dead people? Why don't we apply it to dogs? Why don't we apply it to the poor, wretched person who had so many bad sticks pushing them in the wrong direction? And in all three of these cases, we see that our morality talk is either in the opposite direction of the carrots and the sticks, or it just doesn't overlap at all, right? So Schlick wasn't saying what Campbell is saying. Campbell is saying, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire and apply your theory to these other areas and see if you've really rescued what we care about with morality. And so it would be good to go back to Schlick and see if Campbell is treating him fairly. But from what I remember, that's why Campbell is making this argument. It's not that Schlick said, oh, be more outraged at the poor, wretched fool who couldn't help it. He's saying, I never thought of applying it there. Oops, I guess it doesn't look so good. Or maybe he'd have a better response. Who knows? Does that track? So far, we're good?
Yeah, certainly. It's the one sort of theme that I think that I agree with Campbell that Schlick, in my opinion, I feel like Schlick was rationalizing. He was really pumped up about his idea of like logical positivism. Yeah, whatever his worldview. So he was looking for a way to kind of justify his worldview he wanted to get on with, and so I think there's blind spots here, and I think Campbell was mentioning that.
Yeah, he does. It seemed. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm trying to remember. There was 2 points to his when he touched on this. He said that he was passionate about logical positivism, and then there was the second part of the second factor of that. It might have been that he I forget, but it was exactly what I thought was the problem with Schlick.
Part where he says you shouldn't be congratulating yourself on having solved the problem.
Yeah, I'm gonna grab a book because it was a great. It was pretty brief and it captured what I previously thought. I'm gonna go find this.
So we're getting an interesting history lesson in the history of philosophy from Campbell here, at least from his perspective. And it seems like what he's suggesting is there was a time not too long ago where there was a really exciting atmosphere inside philosophical departments where people thought they could solve problems that had never been solved before, that we've had forever. And Campbell is saying, bad news or good news, depending on how you look at it, the conversation continues. You guys didn't really solve these things that you thought you could solve with your new camp and your new approach. We won't get into the camp and the approach and the history of that, although some of the recommended extra readings in the section on Schlick and Campbell do talk about that. But yeah, Campbell is hinting at the idea that there's a bunch of people who are celebrating the idea that they've solved problems even Socrates couldn't solve. And Campbell's coming in to inform them. I would be grateful for this. I would say in a celebratory way, although I don't think that's necessarily Campbell's tone. I would say, oh, breathe a sigh of relief. We still have the debate and we can still refine our views, and the whole thing is still alive. It hasn't been solved and you put it in the background and now you move on to something else. The debate is still alive and there's something really powerful here to wrestle with. I think Campbell's tone is almost a little bit sadder. It's like, I really wish we could solve it, but I'm going to be honest that you haven't really solved it. But maybe I'm reading too much into the tone. All right, let's move on to this. There's actually questions here on the website, so let's see if they're worth anything. I haven't read them in a while. So if we were inclined to defend Schlick's arguments against the analysis of Campbell given in this article, we might argue effectively in which of the following ways? All right, we basically almost talked about this, but how about this? We should hold animals morally responsible for their choices. We have an arrogance about being human. We aren't that different from animals. In fact, we regularly do hold animals morally responsible for some of their actions. The example given by Campbell of the dog stealing his master's lunch is a good one. The dog looks like he feels guilty even before we apply a punishment to him, as if he knows he did wrong. So Schlick's argument that moral responsibility and punishment to educate for future behavior modification still holds against Campbell's first objection. We could say that. I'll rephrase the question so it's clear what we're doing. So imagine somebody said something like that. The next potential answer is this. It doesn't matter if we don't hold animals morally accountable, because even though we apply punishment to affect their future behavior, such punishment is necessary for moral responsibility, but it isn't sufficient. A man may wish to desire differently in the future. Animals are like robots having feelings of guilt, but because punishment works to affect their behavior, they are like robots without feelings of guilt, but because punishment works to affect their behavior, we still use it without contradicting ourselves that they are not morally responsible for their actions. So before we read the third choice, the point of this question is to say, which of these positions hypothetically would actually help Schlick in defending against Campbell? All right, so keeping that in mind, let's see. Would it help Schlick to say, no, we're just like animals and we should hold animals morally responsible, and that's all there is to morality? Or would it help Schlick's position if we said, no, you're right, there's a difference between animals and people, and we use the punishment because it affects the animal, but animals aren't really morally responsible like people are? And then the third argument from somebody might be something like, we do many things to affect the future which are not punishments. We don't really punish animals. When we're dealing with animals, we're not punishing them. We need a different word for what we do with animals. When we build a dam to prevent a flood, we are affecting the future behavior of streams of water, but we're not therefore punishing or rewarding the water because we are holding the water morally responsible for its actions. No, the same kind of intervention is likewise what we do with animals. We're affecting their future behavior, but we're not really punishing them. So when Schlick says our moral talk is about punishment, we're not punishing animals. We're affecting their future behavior, but they're not morally significant. Even though we often personify animals, the point Campbell is making here is that doing so is an error. Why make that error again when looking for an objection to Schlick's argument? Okay, so here's the question, and I'll say those ideas more briefly. The point of it is to say this. Imagine you're in a classroom and you've read Schlick and you know his arguments. Now you've read Campbell and you've read his argument that no, morality and punishment are different things. Look at how we deal with animals. And then there's three other people in the classroom all trying to defend Schlick. Let's take them one at a time. The first person says this, and when he says this, and I'll say it more briefly, the question is, are we saying they have defended Schlick or they haven't defended Schlick? Is their argument missing the point, or is it actually helping Schlick? And the first person says, Campbell, you're wrong. We do morally hold animals responsible, and we should. That's why we're punishing them. You would never punish a clam. You punish a dog because it can feel shame and guilt, maybe less than we can, but we are punishing them because they're moral creatures to some degree. So your argument that there's no overlap here in the animal case is wrong. The animals are just more morally significant than you've been thinking. Would that argument help Schlick?
I would say no, and I would say that's on the basis of sort of the same method that both of them have been using, like appealing to people's sensibilities, because we all seem to know that animals, including dogs, aren't morally responsible.
Ah, okay. So good. Very good. That's a really good argument against what that student, that hypothetical student, was saying, perhaps. And maybe they're wrong. Now I want to ask a different question. Suppose that they are right, even if you've got arguments that they're wrong. If they were right, would it help Schlick's argument against Campbell's attack? That's a different question, right? If they were right that animals are morally significant and that's why we punish them, does that save Schlick from Campbell's attack that we punish dogs but we don't hold them morally responsible?
Yeah, I mean, wait, if I understand it correctly, I believe that it would help Schlick, and if so Campbell saying that Campbell's identifying like a contradiction and
Counterexample.
yeah, a counterexample. But if there is no difference between humans and dogs, then there would be no contradiction or counterexample, and so
Right on the
it,
nose. Right on the nose. Absolutely correct. Yes. We're not saying the argument from this hypothetical student is correct, but if it was correct, it would be a way of saving Schlick from Campbell's attack. You hit the nail on the head. You saw it clearly. Okay. Let's try the next one. Now, that's what we're asking. Now it's clear what we're asking. We're not saying, is this argument good? Can we argue it? We're saying, if it was true, is it even relevant? Does it even help Schlick? Or does Campbell's point still hit Schlick? Okay, good. That's what we're trying to do. Let's do it with the second one now. The second one is this. Campbell, you're right. We don't hold animals morally responsible. You're right. We don't do that. But that's because punishment is a part of moral responsibility, but it's not all there is to it. Okay? So with people, we care about morality. With animals, we don't hold them morally responsible, but we still punish them to change their actions. But there's a kind of morality that's not just that. Would that help Schlick? If it were true, would it help Schlick to defend against Campbell's attack that Schlick has not saved morality through his talk of punishment and reward?
I think that it would. It's sort of a that one I have to think through a little bit.
That one's maybe let me try to word it again, just so that, because I know it's confusing. It's very complicated. We got Moritz, Schlick, we got Campbell, we got this argument against it. Now we're coming up with another hypothetical argument to defend Schlick, and we're asking the question, not is it correct, but is it helping Schlick at all? So let me do a better job of explaining. What if a student loved Schlick and thought Schlick got it right, he solved the problem, and this evil Campbell comes in to try to knock Schlick down? I'm going to defend Schlick. And so what does Campbell say? Campbell says, look, Schlick, you haven't saved morality by saying it's the same as worrying about who to punish to affect future behavior, because it's about more than that. Look at animals. We don't hold animals morally responsible, but we do punish them to affect their future behavior. So therefore, you must be wrong when you say all we care about with morality is affecting future behavior. And the student says, wait a minute, Campbell, no. Schlick is still right. Here's why he's right. You're right. We don't hold animals morally accountable. And you're right. We do punish them to affect their future behavior. But I say there's more to morality than just that. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to explain what we care about with morality. If the student wanted to defend Schlick and tried to do it that way, would Schlick say, hey, thank you? Yeah. Or would he say, hey, get away from me. You're making my case even worse.
I think it wouldn't help. I think he.
Why?
So I'm just I'm thinking of this sort of. I always try to break things down into their simplest formulaic part. So I'm thinking of what the original formula here for Schlick is like.
Good. Right. Yep.
So it's in my mind earlier. It was like, okay, um, he had his idea X, which was implied equal to Y that he wasn't aware of, but Campbell knew that Y was equal to X, but Schlick wasn't, and so um,
What
but
what
Y,
what was Schlick's original argument?
so that morality is based on um, like behavior that can be corrected with punishment, right?
Okay, so what's the student saying? The student's saying there's more to morality than that.
Yeah, and so that negates Schlick's point there.
That's
So
actually agreeing with Campbell. That's Campbell's
right.
whole. That's exactly right. You did it right. Bravo. Good job. I know these are really complicated, convoluted questions. That's exactly the point. That student is trying to help Schlick, but they're really saying Campbell's point is right. There's more to morality than that. And Schlick's whole point was that's all there is to morality. So thanks for trying to help, but you just kicked me in the balls, is what Schlick would have to say to respond to that. Right? Yeah, these are fun questions. I don't think we've done such fun questions. We might not do them again, but these are really complicated questions. You almost have to write down all of the different moves people are making to solve them. So good job thinking that one through. All right, let's try one more. The third student says, hey, poor Schlick, we got to save him. He almost solved the problem. This Campbell guy is horrible. So the third student says, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to try to defend Schlick's argument. This is really a great question because the more we wrestle with it, the more clearly we can see Schlick and Campbell's positions. But it's a hell of a thing to wrestle through. And I know you guys it's recorded and it's a short amount of time to think through this, but you're doing great. All right, so the third student stands up and they say, wait, I'm going to save Schlick. Here's my argument. We do many things to affect the future. We build a dam to change the course of a river. But we don't say we're punishing the river. Likewise, we're not punishing the dog. We need a different word for what we're doing to the dog. We're not punishing the dog to affect its future behavior because the dog isn't morally responsible. So, Campbell, you said these don't overlap, but really you don't have both things there to not overlap in the first place. You know, you're trying to attack Schlick. He's saying morality, when we talk about it, is just about affecting future behavior. But he's not saying that's the only way we affect future behavior. And every time we affect future behavior, we're doing moral things. The river isn't immoral and it needs its future behavior corrected. Likewise, the dog isn't moral. And what we're doing to it really isn't punishment. You say it's punishment, but it's more like building a dam than spanking a child, something like that. With that argument, if it were true and if somebody said it, would it even be helpful to Schlick? Or would it be missing the point somehow or something like that?
I would think no, because we could make the same case for so-called punishment of human behavior. Like, why can't we rename punishment that's applied to humans, right?
Okay, good. So you're arguing with the student again. Let's leave that alone. Path, Savad, is there anybody who also thinks no or who thinks yes?
I think no, because the argument is ridiculous on its face. You're
Not
talking about you're talking about a river and trying to dam a river in physics and water and flow and velocity, like all kinds of physics related things as opposed to psychology and predicting human behavior or trying. I mean, these things are totally different. Morality and a dam. I mean, I'm
okay.
not convinced. Yeah.
Both Twilight and Path are arguing against the student. That's not the question. The question is, if the student was correct, is it helpful to Schlick? So let's be clear about this for a second, really quickly. The student is not saying that a river is moral, and so we're doing anything moral. He's saying, of course we're not. Likewise, we're not doing anything to count the dog as moral either. We're doing the same kind of manipulation to affect future behavior, and we should just not call it punishment anymore. With people, it's punishment because with people, we're trying to affect their future choices. The dog's not making choices. The river's not making choices. So our attempts to affect their future behavior isn't really punishment at all.
Okay. It seems like Schlick was trying to explain behavior more. So it could be, I mean, I don't like this argument with the dam, to be honest.
Sure.
It seems ridiculous to me. Uh, however, in that context, I would say that it's maybe in a mechanical way, it helps Schlick. I'm not sure that I'm right, though. I'm not confident at all.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe I'm just not doing it. It's a very convoluted kind of argument, and maybe I'm not doing a good job making it clear. Do you have a strong feeling of why it would help Schlick, or no? Because I'll do a better job of explaining it. Maybe I just need to give it a third whack, or maybe it was just a poorly crafted question.
So if I understand the key component of it, I think it revolves around choice, and if animals have the ability to choose, if I understand that right. So I guess it comes down to like I guess it could help Schlick if he makes this argument that animals don't have choice, and so that now that they can make the distinction between animals and humans. So I guess it supports it, but it's contingent.
Why would it help Schlick? What's it doing? What's it doing for him?
So it's making it so it's redefining punishment. He's redefining punishment to like this kind of cold deterrence that isn't based on morality. So morality is based on well, let's see. I guess I have to go back to what Schlick is saying.
All right. The answer is going to be really obvious.
Hey, can I interject? I just have a guess. It's probably wrong.
Sure.
Okay, so when you build a dam in a river, that's one of the most causal things you can do to alter the landscape of the surrounding upstream acres. Yeah,
Okay.
I mean you can decimate a whole city that's upstream by building a dam. So it's very causal. I'm not sure how that relates, but I feel like that is more. So Schlick was trying to provide rationalities for the morality. It seemed like sometimes, if I remember right. And so it seems like, but then again, yeah. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Okay, good. Yeah. All right. The answers can be very obvious with what I say next, and you'll be able to work it out. I'll make it clear. What I did is I made the hypothetical too interesting, and we all want to debate whether or not you can compare affecting the future relationship, the future behavior of a river to the future behavior of a dog.
I'm like, have you ever worked on a dam, bro? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. All right. So let's make it clear. Campbell's argument is here's an instance where we have punishment and no morality. So therefore, you're wrong, Schlick, when you say they're the same thing. This hypothetical student's argument is, no, you don't have punishment there, and you don't have morality. So you're not really attacking Schlick. You said, oh, we're punishing, but we don't believe the dog is morally responsible. And the student's response is, no, we're not really punishing. That's not two separate things, because you're right, there is no morality there, but there's also no punishing there. You're misunderstanding punishment. Punishment still only applies to morality, but morality doesn't apply to dogs, and punishment is not what we're doing to a dog. What we're doing is something like how we would affect the way water falls off our roof by putting a gutter on it. We're changing the future behavior of the water flow, but we're not punishing the water. Likewise, we're not punishing the dog. We're changing its future behavior. You can change future behavior without it always being punishment. So,
yeah, I feel like if I worded my original statement better, it would have been more convincing, because I feel like that's kind of what I was trying to say, is that
well, the
we're
student
talking
is
about a
saying
physical object as a put. How are you going to imply any kind of morality when you're talking about a river and a dam?
He's not implying
That's
morality.
what I was trying to say.
No, Path, you're right, but he's not implying morality. He's saying there's no morality here. There's no morality in a river. There's no morality in a dam. And also there's no punishment. You're not
And that's
punishing.
Campbell. correct?
This is the student. The hypothetical student is saying, Campbell, you're right. There's no morality in a dog. Campbell, you're right, but there's also no punishment. So this isn't an instance of them not overlapping because they're both
Okay.
not involved.
Thank you.
Right. So I'm not making it clear, but he's saying exactly what you're saying. There's no morality in a river, and there's no punishment in the way we behave to change a river's future. There's no morality in a dog, and therefore there's also no punishment when we're trying to change the dog's future behavior. It's just building a dam. We need a new word. It's not punishment. It's changing the behavior without being punishment. And so there's no morality and there's no punishment. And this isn't an instance of a counterexample where you have one without the other. You have neither. So now if it's clear that that's what the student is saying, would that be helpful for Schlick? If it were true, and again, we're not saying it's true. It could be an idiot student who's making this up. We're not trying to say we agree. We're trying to say, if you thought that, would that help?
No, that would help Campbell, I believe.
Twilight, do you agree? We'll just give one more vote for everybody and then we'll clear it up.
I'm still trying to. I feel like it's contingent upon something that, and so when you say assume that it's true, I guess what I'm wondering is assume which part of it is true.
Assume that when we affect the future behavior of a dog, we don't think the dog is moral or morally responsible, but we're also not punishing it. We say we're punishing it, but that's just like anthropomorphizing what we're doing. We're not really punishing the dog. Punishment shouldn't be the word we use for what we're doing there.
I think it supports Schlick, but I guess it comes back to I had a couple of thoughts on how that could not be the case. So I guess
good.
I would go.
All right, we're done. We're done. Okay. So I'm really grateful you're going through this course with me. We've had lots of questions that are helpful. I'm going to chuck this up to, I've set up this question badly, and I'll work on rewording the third option. It's my belief that this would help Schlick if it was true. So it doesn't matter if we can figure it out, and you're just helping me to craft the questions better for the future. So thank you all for being tortured by going through this with me. It helps me to see that this isn't as clear as I thought it might be. And congratulations on y'all working out the first two correctly. I think that this third one would help for the following reason, and I'll work on rewording it.
Can I add in quickly, Zara? Yeah. Sorry.
Please.
Because he has the viewpoint of, well, it's determined, right, for free will. I know from a person's standpoint in saying, look, their character, that this was going to happen, therefore you can determine what they're going to do. And from the point of the animal of saying, well, that's I might have just confused myself here. Sorry. Of saying, well, that's just what the animal is going to do. There is no morality necessarily with the animal. It's going to do what it's trained to do, and based on what you trained it to do or what its natural instincts are, then that's just what the dog is going to do.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think you're right. And I think that one of the things that we're all revolting against is that I think Campbell's attack on Schlick stands, and that it's not actually possible to save Schlick in any of these ways necessarily. We'll move on from the question, but I think you're right. So I think it's important that when Schlick reduces morality to identifying the correct person to punish, he's not saying all attempts to affect future behavior are morally significant. Like the river obviously isn't. And I don't think he was claiming that, or that that's a weakness in his position. However, I think Campbell's argument, it's hard to see how we're going to save Schlick from it. It's pretty devastating. His arguments in my opinion, and the conversation can go on, and maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think saving Schlick is a pretty hard thing to do. When we started this, I was going to celebrate and say, hey, we're going to finish Campbell today, and we're definitely going to finish the whole determinism section by the end of August like we planned, and then we'll move on to the mind-body, which is what you guys voted on. And so we're kind of on schedule, which is sort of exciting. I thought we'd finish Campbell today, but I have my doubts now. We've barely gotten through his very first opening throat-clearing introduction. So let's do this. Let's finish these questions. True or false? Inference question. Campbell believes that Schlick's theory. So Campbell believes that Schlick's theory requires that moral responsibility is always greater when a man's behavior is more predictable. You know what? We're not going to go into these questions anymore. Let's move on. I think we already understand well enough what's happening here, and we'll look at questions in the future. So the next section that Campbell goes into brings up this idea of ought and can. So really quickly, he sort of threw some missiles at Schlick to say, hey, you didn't really solve the problem. And one of the things that might be wrong about this is to say, well, maybe you picked a particularly easy compatibilist to attack. I mean, the other compatibilists aren't all in Schlick's camp, and yet they're trying to rescue determinism and morality and freedom and will at the same time. And so, maybe you blew Schlick out of the water, but that doesn't mean you've really blown apart all the compatibilists. Well, Campbell really does look at categories of compatibilists, and he tries to say, I don't think this means anything. I don't think this means anything. This might mean something, but it's not good enough, and I'll attack it. So he's not just going to talk about Schlick. However, he moves on now that he's dealt with Schlick by throwing those missiles to say, okay, let me define what I think we really mean by morality. Now that I've shown that Schlick is wrong, let me tell you what morality is really all about. And then you tell me if you think you can make that compatible with your determinism idea. Even your understanding that determinism is descriptive and not prescriptive, and it doesn't have compulsion, but it is able to predict everything if it had all the data. Let me tell you if you can really reconcile these two things. So first he attacks Schlick's idea of morality, but then he gives his own, and he says, this is what I think we're really after with morality. This is what I would like to see saved. And if you can save that, I'll be a compatibilist. But if you can't, we need to have the argument between the determinists and the libertarians again, and the compatibilists need to back off and let the battle happen, right? So here's what he says. And he brings up an idea in philosophy that a lot of philosophers will quote. It's an idea that comes up a lot. And it's the idea that ought implies can. When you say you ought to do something, what you mean, you can never say that somebody ought to do something if they're not capable of doing it, if it's not physically possible. So ought implies can. And what Campbell is going to say is determinism implies there's no such thing as can. You can't do anything other than what you did. And so ought is meaningless. We lose morality, and we lose morality talk if there aren't real possibilities of having done otherwise than how we did. Okay, so he's going to first argue that that's what we really care about to rescue in morality. And then he's going to say that's incompatible with the idea that things are determined. If things are determined, then there's no actual real other thing you could have done. And this idea has come up, and different compatibilists have tried to deal with it in different ways. And Campbell says, I'm going to show that the first way is totally meaningless and the second way is totally meaningless. And the only one that seems to even be on point at all is this other one. And then he's going to try to argue against that. And then he's going to say, okay, there's still another challenge, which is how can you have an indeterminist idea that's even coherent? So he's going to try to say that so after he says that they're incompatible, he's going to say the libertarian idea is still coherent. It could be true. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. And then he's going to stop. And instead of proving that we have freedom and proving determinism is false, he says, okay, I'm done with my work for the day. What I wanted to do was let you know that the battle needs to happen. And to do that, I have to do two things. One, I have to prove that the libertarians have a point, that there's some part of morality that what they're saying is coherent and could be true hypothetically. And I have to show that the compatibilists can't reconcile what they care about, what I care about, with even that descriptive type of determinism. We need a contra-causal kind of freedom. And determinism, if it means anything, is that things are caused, and that's a rule you can never break. So once he's done with that, he doesn't go on to prove that we're free. He just says, let the battle rage on again. Get rid of these pesky compatibilists who say, let's just sit here and believe we have both of the things. We don't. Okay, so the next step he has to do after blowing Schlick out of the water, he thinks, or maybe we agree, is to argue about ought implies can. So here's what he says. Those who regard this problem as a pseudo-problem, the compatibilists, tend to think, when we are trying to determine if a man is morally responsible, we are trying to figure out if his behavior is blameworthy or rightly the subject of punishment. At least he thinks this is part of the formula. Why is he so sure? Why is he so sure that morality has anything to do with that? If we think a man is less responsible in his behavior, we think that a man, again, he's going to look at the way we talk about morality. He says, we think a man is less responsible if his behavior is heavily influenced by a bad upbringing, for instance. Now he's going to make a new point about this, which is really, really strong. That's what we do. We say you're less responsible the more you're determined. And we make partial allowances in such cases. So doesn't it follow that if a man was totally forced to behave in a certain way, that it was impossible for him to act otherwise, maybe based on a really bad upbringing, say?
That's a great argument.
That if that was the case, he would be completely free of blame and we'd have no morality talk at all, right? If you're forced to behave the way you behave, if you have to do it and you don't have the freedom to break the chains of that, well, then isn't that the final extreme of saying you're less responsible the more you're compelled? And if that's the case, even your descriptive determinism means that I couldn't possibly have done anything other than what I was going to do. So if it's correct, morality gets reduced to zero. It gets reduced the more you're compelled and forced. If you were totally forced, it would come down to zero. That's simple. Doesn't this mean, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just had to say, like, I feel like that argument on its own, it could devastate Schlick, in its own right.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I think, look, the compatibilists are really interesting, and it would be wrong to think that Schlick and what he wrote was the end of what they have to say. There's some really genius compatibilists out there, and you should dive into them, and we're going to talk about some other ones in the future. However, Campbell is doing a pretty powerful job of saying to the people who think there isn't a problem here, there's a problem here. I think Campbell might win the day against all the compatibilists in the final analysis, perhaps. I'm not saying he does, but you shouldn't give up on compatibilism just because of Schlick. Again, we don't want to pick on him. He did a really cool job, and we really enjoyed reading what he wrote. And maybe there's some stuff there that really counts. But we shouldn't never listen to another compatibilist. They're not all Schlick. But I have to agree with you, Twilight. Campbell is doing a hell of a job here. And it's important to notice that when he says you're totally forced, he doesn't mean compulsion, right? He could even agree that the compatibilists have understood correctly that there is no compulsion in the causality principle. It's not making you do it against your will, but it is just descriptive. And even if it's just descriptive, it's precluding the possibility that you really could have done otherwise. And that's all that matters. That's why he talks about a contra-causal freedom, something that's breaking the chain, really like we did in our introduction. He really wants something that breaks the chain of causality if he's going to say that there's any meaning to freedom and moral responsibility. And he makes this, like you said, really good argument. He says the more you're forced in other ways to do something, the less we say you're responsible, right? Put a gun to my head. You don't really blame me for robbing the bank. The guy told me I had to or he'd kill my family, right? I'm less responsible the more I'm forced. So if I really don't have a choice, if there's no way I could have done otherwise, then I'm not morally responsible at all. You've reduced morality to zero. And then Campbell says, I want morality. I think we should save morality. So let's beat the hell out of determinism. It must be false. But he doesn't go all the way to prove any of it. But he says, let's have the argument. The determinists, take out your cannons again. We've got our snipers in the trees. Let's fight this out until we either rescue our morality that really matters, or we rescue determinism and say, well, I wanted that morality, but the truth is I'm a puppet on a string, right? But we can't go with the compatibilists who say, oh, there isn't really a problem here. Look, I solved it. That's Campbell's whole point of what we're reading. Okay, so go ahead.
No, I think it's a quick question. In our textbook, Paul Ray was the first determinist that we read, but chronologically speaking, who would be the first philosopher that spoke about determinism, in your opinion? Any Greeks, or it seems all these guys are more modern. So I'm just wondering if there's a previous source.
Yeah, these guys are modern. That's a great question. These are called the enduring questions for a reason. When we start our second year course, where instead of cherry picking and looking at just arguments, we actually start at the beginning and go through. One of the things that's really shocking when you study the history of philosophy, and I think this is the case, everything in philosophy is arguable, but I've made this case against some really good colleagues, and they think that this might be correct, is that there's nothing new under the sun. It's surprising when you realize that there are sort of inclinations of ways to think and ideas and camps that can be defended. And if you're being fair in the history of philosophy, it's all in Plato. It's all in the pre-Socratics. It's all there. This stuff, you might find someone who deals with it even more sophisticatedly than what we're dealing with today. I think you'll find Socrates dealing with these questions in a more serious way than any of the people we've read. And that's been my experience. I can't prove that to you right now, but we'll have to run the experiment ourselves in the third year or the second year. Well, after
no worries. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, the advance of philosophy. There are advances that can be made in philosophy, and we talk about that in the beginning of the second year backbone course. To say, well, okay, if these questions are still the same in a sense, well, what kind of progress are we making in philosophy? And there's answers to that, and we'll talk about that in the very beginning of that class, and we'll conceptualize.
Yeah, I figured there was some previous discussions on that. They didn't just show up in the 1840s or, whatever decade that was with Paul Ray.
Let me see.
But I don't remember reading in this textbook about anybody prior to that regarding this topic.
So there is an evolution.
But Plato's a good answer. I haven't read any Plato, so I wouldn't know. So thank you.
There is an evolution of the conversation. I don't want to speak inaccurately. There are things that change and whatever, but there's also progress that can be made, I think, in philosophy too. We'll define it very differently than you might expect. Let me try to answer your question the way you actually asked it, though, and give you a name of somebody in ancient Greece that I think is a Paul Ray type. There's a few, but let me see if I can give an honest, fair one that I know enough about to really be confident in. I don't think that counts. Does that count?
I feel like you already answered it with Plato, but yeah.
No, I'm saying in Plato there are people who make the arguments. That I was trying to think maybe I could say I'm trying to say something other than determinist atomists and things like that and give you names of people like that. I'm trying to say something like Thrasymachus. I don't mean Plato agrees with Paul Ray. I mean that Plato has characters making arguments that are very sophisticated from different camps and different positions. And so the ideas are considered, right? So I'm not saying Plato is a Paul Ray. I'm saying the conversation about things like this isn't waiting for Paul Ray to show up for somebody to have that type of an attitude towards it. So how about I get back to you? I don't want to misspeak and slander somebody.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
Miscategorize.
But it seems like okay. Let me change the question. The term determinism, did it pop up with Paul Ray, or it seems like it did?
No, I don't think
No.
so. I don't think
Okay,
so.
all right.
So.
Okay, yeah, I have no idea. Yeah, no
It-
worries, man. Carry on.
So we have a similar idea in medieval philosophy of predetermination, right? Predestination in the religious philosophers that's been pointed out before already. So the whole Calvinist Arminianist debate is about this very same thing. They're just conceptualizing the universe as a whole, as God, as the source of everything, which there might be a reason to think that those terms overlap quite a great deal or might be interchangeable. I'm sorry, I keep expecting Savad to interject, but I realize he doesn't have the ability to do that where he is right now, and he's writing comments that I'm ignoring. So hold on. Contra-causal freedom and creative ongoing creation of being. Yeah. He gets to that. Yeah, all right. He gets to that at the end of his essay. It's really something to read when you realize what he's saying. Willingness to take on a terrifying unknowable. Yeah, you've understood, Savad. This is the scary, terrifying, spiritually significant place that he's in. And I think psychologically it reveals more about why the camps are in the camps they are, because the idea of unknowable is too terrifying to some. And the idea of not being free is too terrifying to others. And yeah, we're going to talk about everything that you just wrote about in great detail before we finish at near the end of the Campbell essay. I think you're hitting the nail on the head there. What an insightful human becoming greater than human being. Yeah. I think that Campbell doesn't talk explicitly about all of this, but it's very clearly what it's the underpinning of where he's coming from, and it's revealed in some of what he's saying there. And we're going to talk about that for sure. Okay, yeah, and I'm glad we got to read that before you had to go. So when you have to go, we probably won't finish Campbell today. So we'll come back and we'll be able to talk about all of that the next time, because we're going to have to do this tomorrow too. Okay, let's at least finish this part. Doesn't this mean that if a man cannot act otherwise than he did, that we would have no right to blame him? But this is precisely the situation in all instances if we are determined to act the way we do by our natures and our external stimulus, no bit of which do we control. Ought implies can. If it's not possible to act other than you did, then you can't say that there's anything like a duty or an ought or you should. Those terms mean nothing if there's no actual can. And then here's a little block quote. Hence, if we morally blame A for not having done X, we imply that he could have done X, even though in fact he did not. In other words, we imply that A could have acted otherwise than he did. And that means that we imply, as a necessary condition of a man's being morally blameworthy, that he enjoyed a freedom of a kind not compatible with unbroken causal continuity. So holy mackerel. I thought we'd get through all of Campbell, but Campbell is pretty awesome, and we're going to have to do the rest of him tomorrow. But let's look at what he did in his first two moves. These are just his first two punches in the boxing ring. The first one is, we're going to mix metaphors, is he sent 3 missiles and tried to blow Schlick as an example of compatibilism completely out of the water and say, look, if there is a compatibilism, yours didn't do it. And that type of thinking you can solve the problem in that way is highly suspect now. And then he says, it's all based on your misunderstanding of what we mean by morality that the libertarians want to preserve. And then in his second punch, he says, let's be clear about this. what we want to rescue with morality, and maybe we can't, maybe we'll have to give up morality and just accept that we're in a deterministic world. Let's have the fight out. But the reason why I'm on the morality side and hoping we can defeat determinism is this. What we really mean by morally responsible implies you could have done something else. There's no morality. Now, this is Campbell. We might argue with him. Maybe someone else will argue. But Campbell is saying you can't say someone should have done otherwise unless they could have done otherwise. Here's a good example. If somebody comes to me and they say, hey, your whole family was murdered upstairs and you just stayed downstairs the whole time like a coward, you should have done something about it. And my response is, well, I was handcuffed, tied up, and locked in a trunk, and I couldn't have done anything about it. The answer isn't, no, you should have done something. The answer is, oh, I didn't know that. Okay, yeah, well, you should have if you could have, but you couldn't, so there's no should to talk about, right? If somebody stays in the basement saying, oh, no, I'm too afraid to do anything, then you say, hey, what are you, a coward? You are a coward. You should have done otherwise. That means something. But Campbell is saying the only reason it means something is that it implies that you're not tied up in a trunk, unable to do anything. Likewise, it implies that you really could have done otherwise. But if determinism, even the descriptive kind of determinism, is true, that's nonsense. You can't actually do something other than what the causal principle determines that you will do. And determines doesn't mean compels. It just means can predict you will do. That's what you have to do. That's the only thing you could possibly do. And so all of my you should have means nothing because I don't have the implied necessary you could have. All right, that's his second punch. Look, we're not going to say Campbell is right. Maybe there's a compatibilism that works. But we can say Campbell is doing a great job of coming in after we've got all these great, think about how great our class was on Tuesday, where we're like, look how great Schlick is. He says you can have your cake and eat it too. And damn, it's a pretty good argument. And he's only one of many compatibilists. And by the way, we still have to deal with the compatibilists more thoroughly because there's other arguments from their camp. But Campbell is saying, look, take all the compatibilists. Let me hit you all with these two punches. And those are just his first two punches. And then we'll have to finish the rest of this on Friday and say, does he really defeat them, or do they have a way of getting back up off the ground? And if he does defeat them, then we're back in the place we were when we started. We're back in the place we were when we started. Determinism seems to be a threat to morality. And freedom, the kind I think I have, is a threat to determinism. And some people really think we have to hold on to this, and some people really think we have to hold on to this. So have at it, boys. See who can prove the other one wrong so you get your favorite toy back, because you can't have both. And that's what Campbell is doing. He's reviving the conversation, bringing it back and saying, all these compatibilists, they told you could have both. Fuck that. No, you can't. The kind of freedom I want doesn't have to do with punishment. It doesn't have to do with changing my future behavior. It has to do with I really could have done otherwise, which is why it's right to say boo to me if I do the wrong thing. That's the kind of morality that you really need. And if you take away I could have done otherwise, you really have to throw out you should have done otherwise, because should have done otherwise means could have done otherwise implied within it. So I'm going to shut up and say, what do you guys think about that? Should implies could.
Yeah, that was actually my I meant to mention that in the last class because this was my thinking. It stemmed from, so coming back to Schlick's whole thing, I felt like he was making maybe not too important of a distinction between descriptive and coercive, because what I was going to mention in the last class is, wouldn't even Schlick admit that, according to his conception of determinism, there's only one way. You know, you can call it what you want, necessary, whatever, descriptive, whatever. There's still only one way, and if there's only one way, there's no other way. And so the train of thinking that Campbell's on, I'm completely in agreement with. The only thing that got me confused was I was like, okay, you know, we're on the same page. And then he critiqued himself, and then he started like making all these super like, maybe it's just because it was my first read through, but he was really getting into the finer details of what uh this phrase meant, could have done otherwise or something like that. And like he gave like three different or four
Campbell.
different
Yes.
possibilities. And I was like, you know, it gets
Well,
to a
okay.
point.
So let's talk about why he did that. No, you're right. Campbell definitely did that. That's where, okay, so Campbell's not the first person to bring up the idea A could have not done X, right? This question of could have done otherwise has been the way that other compatibilists have framed the question. And they try to get rid of the problem in very different ways. And so Campbell is talking about three different ways that they have tried to explain that away. Right. So we'll look at that next time. But yeah, that's why he goes into all these different ways of trying to understand what does A could have not done X or A could have done X really mean. And the compatibilists, there's a lot more of them than Schlick, but the compatibilists at the time have found different ways of trying to deal with that sentence. And Campbell says, okay, all of the ones dealing with it like this are not even talking about what we're talking about. And he tries to prove, and I think he does, he has another really good punch there. He says that you change the subject and you're doing a hat trick. You're doing some sleight of hand to fool some people, but you missed the point. And he does the same thing with the second group. And then he says the third group have a point. They're at least on point with what we're talking about. And then he tries to defeat them and give an argument against their position. But all of these are different ways that compatibilists are trying to explain away so that you can still have the phrase A could have done X while still holding on to determinism. And so they're trying to say, well, what we mean by A could have done X really is this or this. And Campbell is looking at all the ways that they try to interpret it so that they can keep it, because they do agree, unlike Schlick, who thinks it all comes down to punishment, they do agree that that is what we're trying to rescue. But there are compatibilists who try to rescue that phrase and say, no, A could have done X is meaningful. And the way it's meaningful is totally compatible with determinism. So in the next class on Friday, we'll look at exactly what you're saying. And the reason why Campbell is doing all of these ways of looking at what does A could have done X mean is that all these other compatibilists have already done that. And he's addressing their attempts to reconcile that with determinism. And he's going to say, look, you're not doing it at all. You're playing a trick of words. These guys are talking about it, but here's what they're saying, and that's not good enough. So yeah. Does that address what you're talking about?
Oh yeah, 100%. And that's actually exactly the way you said it, a hat trick. That's actually how I see the compatibilists performing. However, I will say I wasn't a fan of Mill as far as his writing style. I was a fan of Schlick with his thinking and his writing style, but all while I knew that he was basically doing a hat trick. And the way that I would think of Schlick as like a lawyer or somebody who really captures like the essence of rationalizing. Like it's just he does such a good way of like proving his worldview or so, like not proving but like demonstrating an argument for his worldview or whatever.
I think that's it's cool that you had that same instinct that Campbell had. It's kind of interesting to be in this class where everybody is having sort of these instincts in this libertarian direction, which is so counter the fad right now, which is cool. I think to be fair to Schlick, I don't think he's consciously trying to fool anybody. I don't think that you said that or that Campbell is saying that. I think that he's trying to solve a problem and he's too easily convinced that he did, according to Campbell, right? I mean, it's not like he's trying to trick people. He's really saying, oh, look, I solved the problem. This just means this. This just means this. It totally works. The other way that we should be fair to the compatibilists is they're not all Schlick. right? We already know they're not all Schlick because Schlick doesn't even care about this phrase, and yet Campbell's responding to a whole bunch of other people who maybe had much stronger arguments than Schlick had. And the other way we should be fair to the compatibilists is that, one, their motivation to rescue a world that we can make sense of and a world that has morality in it seems like a nice, it doesn't seem like they have evil motivations in doing that. We have to remember that Campbell, his position on this is exactly the same as Paul Ray's. Right, and by the way, Paul Ray doesn't have bad motivations either. I think that that wouldn't be fair to him. But they both agree you can't have them both. Paul Ray says, I want to keep this one. Campbell says, I want to keep this one. And they have their arguments and their battle, but they both agree you can't have both. The compatibilists are trying to say, look, there's a reason you want to have this. I get it. There's a reason you want to have that. I think we should have that. Let's see if we can have them both. And so all the compatibilists are trying to do is rescue them both. Campbell is saying, look, we can't have both. I choose determinism, which is why there isn't actually any freedom. And guys like William James and Campbell say, look, I think freedom is real, therefore determinism must be false. But they're all in agreement with what the problem is. The compatibilists are trying to solve the problem not by saying determinists win or libertarians win. They're trying to say we can have our cake and eat it too, and isn't that great? Well, there's nothing evil about that. And even if Campbell's right that they've convinced themselves they've solved it when they really haven't, they're probably fooling themselves as well. I don't think there's anything disingenuous about Schlick. I will say that Schlick is easier to read. Mill is probably a lot more impressive intellectually. And so the third way we want to be fair to the compatibilists is to say there's other compatibilists who've come after all of this, who have tried to find ways of responding to guys like Campbell. And the conversation is in no ways over. It's not like, first of all, compatibilists are the largest camp that exists today. That's no reason for us to think they're right. But they're the largest fad in philosophy. They are dwindling in the sense that a lot of people are starting to say, wait a minute, I don't really have the freedom I thought I had, or I don't really have the determinism I thought I have. And so they're dwindling, but they have done the most successful job of convincing people so far where we are right now. Again, that doesn't mean they're right. Obviously, that doesn't mean they're right. We're not looking to join a fad. We're looking to think. So we want to be fair to the compatibilists. But while we're reading Campbell, we have to admit he's doing he's doing a heck of a job making the case that there's a problem here that hasn't been solved yet. So, and I think I have the same instinct as you do that Campbell's right against Schlick. I think we shouldn't really say something like that. There are ways of defending Schlick's perspective that would respond to Campbell and sophisticate his perspective in a way that he could respond. That conversation has continued. So we don't want to be unfair to the compatibilists, but in the part of what we've learned so far, it's Campbell has something to say, and he's doing a heck of a job. He really is doing a heck of a job. I'm rambling now at this point. I'm just repeating myself, so I'm gonna shut up. Was that on point, or did I forget?
No, that's. I think it's a fair assessment. I another note I had, like a sort of mental note I had on Campbell was, I think there's something to be said of somebody who gives fair treatment to competing ideas. So I mean, I don't know if I'm right in saying this, but it seems like of all the people we've read, at least so far, it seems like Campbell has been most diligent in being fair with the ideas he's criticizing, although it might have been because he's responding directly. But I just think that I think an idea is mature if it has the space to give be magnanimous with other competing ideas or whatever. So I just think that's points for Campbell in my opinion.
Is there somebody else that has that we've read that you think was unfair? Because I think you're absolutely right. You're not making an argument, if you're arguing against a bad version of your opponent, you have to be fair to make a case. And Campbell is certainly being snarky as hell. I mean, it's in between what he's saying, but he's being very snarky about the compatibilists, which, you know, I think is tonally appropriate since they were celebrating how much they'd solved the problem. And I think Campbell has an important point to make that they hadn't, at least at that point. But do you think anybody else we've read has been unfair where you say, yeah?
I don't know that I would call. I'm trying to think of like kind of the snarkiest ones, but like for instance, Paul Ray. So I guess I'd have to read him again, but I don't know how much. You know, he kind of had a narrow like tone. Like he was very dead set, and maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe I might have to read him again to check and make sure, because he probably listed like, you know, like conceivable objections and then knocked them down. I guess it's a matter of like raising anticipated objections, but then also being fair in making them sufficiently strong. You know, like it's easy to knock down a straw man. It's easy to knock down like, oh, this is what my opponent would say, but really they're not saying that. Really, so I don't know. I guess I'd have to go back, but I just felt that Campbell was very diligent in, you know, whether his tone was this way or that. I think he was effortful in getting the opponent's position right.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and I think that's part of what makes Campbell's essays so strong is that he's not changing the subject. He's really, really wrestling with what they're saying. I think that's correct. Here's a question, though. How do you know that the off-puttedness you have of Paul Ray's performance isn't due to the fact that you don't like his conclusion, rather than that he actually wasn't being fair to potential other thoughts?
That's a good question. I'd have to really go back and reread it because it might have been my impression, but I'd have to go back and see how he handled possible objections. But I just seem to remember again. I would say he was actually my favorite writer so far. Campbell's near down. Well, I guess favorite. It's a double-edged sword again, but so in a way, I really like Paul Ray. Because even though I seem to lean into the libertarianism, I would put probably determinism next to them because I think that they are, I don't know, I guess just they're most sensible. I think they're more sensible than the compatibilists.
This is a cool question. Yeah, that's what you were saying. I thought that's what you're saying. That's interesting. So you're inclined to libertarianism, but if you really had to give it up, you wouldn't go to compatibilism. You'd just go straight to determinism. That's cool. That's cool. Yeah. I see why you think that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I just think they're more, I don't know, like they're not they're not grasping. I just, the tone, like the feeling, the impression that I get from Schlick and Mill, if I could understand him right, was that it's like I just get this feeling that they're really grasping. They're like, okay, we have to, like you said, we have to make sense. What we have to have these ideas sensibly, you know, equal to determinism, but also live morally. And like, you know, it's like how do we live in this world that that's deterministic yet moral, and like they're really, in my opinion, uneducated opinion, they're grasping. But that's just maybe because that's my preconceived notion. I don't know, but
well, no, that's the impression that their writing is making on you, and I think that's a good instinct, and I think it's probably triggered by something going on. And maybe you'll find as you study compatibilists more that they can slowly start to convince you, say, wow, you really have something here. But maybe what you'll find is, yeah, my original instinct here just keeps being reconfirmed that like you guys you're trying to hold it all together, but it really doesn't hold. These things are opposites. And most people have that feeling. Now, that's why this debate exists. So I will say of Paul Ray, we should also be fair in the sense that we say, look, I mean, Sam Harris, Scott Adams, there's all sorts of contemporary, modern, today thinkers who make the Paul Ray argument, and they don't seem like snarky jerks. They don't seem like they're disregarding what they're making, so what we have to remember is that Paul Ray maybe is coming before this conversation got so sophisticated. And maybe part of the reason it got so sophisticated is that he ventured into the conversation and forced people to try to answer why he's wrong, and then back and forth and back and forth. So part of Paul Ray is that he's so sure he's right that it can be annoying to us, especially if we have libertarian instincts or inclinations. We look at his arguments, we say, you didn't even argue for determinism at all. You just sort of stated it as true and then looked at and followed it consistently, which was very impressive, to its conclusions. But you basically stated a matter of faith, and you didn't really give us any arguments. Well, maybe we can say he was kickstarting the conversation, and I imagine he'd have a lot to say in response to these other arguments. But, he came first before the other people were reading right now. So we should be fair to him in a sense, I think. I don't think he's doing a lot of straw manning. I think he's saying, hey, let me take this principle that we all know is true, and let me follow it to its logical conclusion in an integral, steadfast way. And wherever it leads, I'm going to just accept that. Oh, it leads to no freedom. Fine, we're not free. I accept that because I'm being consistent, and there's something impressive about that.
Yeah, I think I agree. I guess a better way for me to rephrase it is, while the other writers, I don't think that they were unfair. And I think this does go back to the fact that Campbell was responding directly. But while they weren't unfair, it just appeared to me that Campbell was excessively fair. Maybe he was like really trying to be super fair. I don't know if
I think you're right when you say it's because he's responding directly to their things, that's what's making this be highlighted. And I think you're right. And I think it is really fun. So one of the things we talked about last time, at least in the after show or whatever, is that on the website, we've added JSTOR links to all sorts of great contributors who are directly arguing with each other on this topic. And I think if you're really enjoying this Campbell thing, where you can really see the boxers and who they're fighting with and how they're fighting well and really interacting, and are their punches landing, you might go and look at those JSTOR articles and see more, some of the same thinkers, but other thinkers who are major in this field responding to each other's arguments about A could have done B, and what does that really mean? And it sounds like you really like that, and that's a good thing to really like. And so I would say if you want to do more of that, dive in, and that would be a good resources, all those links we put on there.
Yeah, definitely. I plan on going back and reading. Well, I know there's different ones I plan. I want to go back and read William James, but I definitely right now, like, I would say my guy right now is Campbell. I put him on the map as like, this is kind of the guy that he annoys the hell out of me. but
he hasn't approved libertarianism. He just said, let's get back to the fight again.
Yeah.
So we don't even know his argument. I mean, I don't know how much you can like him as a libertarian. He hasn't given, well, he's given some. He showed it's coherent. He tried to show it's not something you can just dismiss, but he didn't prove that it wins over determinism or anything like that. But you should be curious to find out what his arguments for that are.
Oh, yeah. Like, what I really was interested in was his distinction between character and self. Like, that was really neat that he kind of boiled it down that way and sort of put himself out there to, like, because that's conceptualizing that way so concretely can leave yourself open to attack too. So it's like he must have put some thought into this. And so I started thinking about it. Like, I've basically thought this way before, but not really like put it into words concretely. And it's like, oh, it's pretty neat. I don't know. So yeah,
that's good. I'm glad you like him so much. I forgot how good he was when I went to make the notes for the class and everything. I really had forgotten how good he was. We only have 2 other guys to read, and one of them is pretty brief, although it's really interesting. So we're going to spend all of tomorrow's class doing the rest of Campbell, which I didn't think we were going to do 2 classes on it, but this is really worth doing slowly and carefully, and it's really awesome, and there's a lot in there. So we'll get to all those things you like about self and character tomorrow. Let's end the broadcast and go into the after show and have our even better conversations that nobody gets to see. And so we'll go do that now. Let me end this.